It's perfectly browned, it's melty, it's sweet. It's the s'more you just cooked over the fire at AutoCamp. That's right, Hilton brings you new ways to stay, where you don't just get nightly s'mores. You also get clubhouse happy hours to gather under the stars. All while staying in custom-designed airstreams, cabins, and tents, and insanely cool outdoor destinations. If AutoCamp sounds like a dream, it sounds like it's time to redeem those Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This is Fortune's Wheel, podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complimentary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that didn't make it into the public show, such as the series called Context of a Conquest, in which we learn about various goings-on happening in the background of William the Conqueror's conquest of England. We're currently enjoying a series called The Book of Alexios that has already shown the rise of the great Alexios Komnenos and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect, directly anyway, the main storyline of our public show. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. Jumping right into it, this is episode 135 entitled Arrival of the Venetians? Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. So Robert Guiscard is moving north toward Durazzo, the key to the entire invasion. Controlling both sides of the Adriatic, something he is closing in on with his capture of the island of Corfu in early June of 1081, is within his grasp. But Durazzo was the key city on the eastern Adriatic, directly across from Bari. Durazzo was also the terminus for the famous Via Egnatia, an ancient Roman highway leading straight across the Balkans to Constantinople. Guiscard needed Durazzo, but Durazzo was currently led by a shining star within the Byzantine military hierarchy, a man that Emperor Alexios I happened to trust wholeheartedly, a man named Georgios Palaiologos. Corfu may have folded like a cheap suit, but Durazzo would be another matter entirely. He had already crossed the rather moody Strait of Otranto, which separates the Adriatic in the north with the Ionian Sea, which is the body of water crossing from Greece's western edge all the way across to the sole of Italy's boot. Side note, it's worth noting that the Mediterranean Sea is really just a collective name for the many, many, many seas and bays and straits and harbors for that entire region in the world. From west to east, the Mediterranean Sea is a collection of more than 15 seas alone. This, the Strait of Otranto, was a heavily traveled strait. Romans and Greeks have traversed this strait for well over a millennia. Then came the Byzantines, then the Lombards, then the Venetians, and now the Normans. Sprinkle in a healthy smattering of Phoenicians, Egyptians, Carthaginians, Jews, Arabs, Spanish, French, Pisans, Genoese, and even Vikings. Yes, the Vikings. And you have a major thoroughfare in the Mediterranean region since time immemorial. As the name implies, the Mediterranean was truly, truly the middle of the world, the crossroads for civilizations for as long as human history remembers. In fact, in many ways, certainly in its easternmost shores, it still very much is today. It's important to understand that these waves, these lands, these cities and towns and villages and ports, they have been there for as long as history has existed. For instance, the modern city of Durrës in Albania was known before as Durazzo. Before that, it was the ancient city of Dyrrhachium, founded in the 600s BC. and it hosted an historically pivotal battle between Julius Caesar and Pompey in 43 BC. Corfu was founded even earlier in the 700s BC by Greek merchants. Back on the Italian mainland, Otranto was one of the earliest sites of agricultural communities on the entire peninsula, dating as far back as 3,000 years ago. Bari has been dated to at least 1500 BC. Brindisi was formerly recognized as a Roman outpost in the year 266 BC, but it had existed for centuries before. Taranto was founded by Spartans in 706 BC. I'm not sure about our listeners in other parts of the world, such as the UK or Germany or even Italy, but the American mind has a hard time wrapping our heads around such deep, deep history. I mean, what we perceive as the most powerful city in the modern world, Washington, D.C., was officially designed on paper, laid out, and officially founded not even 250 years ago. As far as Native American history goes, the largest site north of the Rio Grande was near East St. Louis, Illinois. It's called Cahokia. I've been there, and it's nothing but giant mounds of dirt today. Impressive, awe-inspiring, and at its peak, it housed around 1 million people in the year 1000 AD. But even Cahokia doesn't hold a candle to the deep history in places like Bari or Durrës. I know, that was a tangent, but as I always say, tangents do allow us to reflect and to reorganize and to gain perspective. I urge everyone to stop and reflect when you study history. It's really the only way to encapsulate the deeper meanings behind our stories. Gives us a sense of place. So, we're talking about a deeply ancient part of the world, and the people living there reflected that. They lived it in their daily lives, whether they were aware of it or not. And these newcomers, historically speaking at least, were making their ways on an invasion that had the potential to upturn centuries of relative stability. Robert Guiscard and his son Bohemond, remember his heir Roger Borsa was interim duke back home holding down the fort while dad was away, so that's why he wasn't there. But Robert Guiscard and Bohemond, his wife Sikelgaita, and all the Normans and Lombards and Saracens participating in Guiscard's invasion of eastern Rome may not have been acutely aware of this historical depth, but they must have had a sense of it. The land, its people, the waves, they all held a deep, deep story that emanated, and as far as I've read, still emanates from its presence. The languages spoken, the traditions and rituals practiced, the deities celebrated and feared, the monsters outwitted, the trinkets and foodstuffs traded, the families created, and the communities that coalesced in this region hold far more stories than history even remembers. There's a lot over there in Europe and Africa and the Middle East and Asia that are like that. Guiscard must have known that his adventure must have been a drop in the bucket with the rest of history in the area. Many of these lands may have been wild lands, but they were not virgin lands. They had been charted and spoken about and documented for centuries, and that word underplays it. So Guiscard had a good idea what was over there, which is how he knew the best course of action to take as he started this next epic journey. Step 1, take control of the Strait of Otranto. This involved connecting his Norman Apulia to the historically strategic island of Corfu, complete with its ports and fortresses. This was accomplished by Guiscard when he finally arrived. We saw that in the end of the last episode. Then take control of the tiny strait between Corfu and the mainland to ensure a mainland access point with security. This was accomplished by both Guiscard and Bohemond, while Bohemond waited on Guiscard to come help with Corfu. So it didn't go exactly as planned, but it still turned out okay. Step 2, make their way up the coast about 95 miles or so to the city of Durazzo, the real prize of this first phase of the invasion. The thing about marching north along the coast was that the Albanian coast is incredibly difficult to traverse. This was precisely why the ancients decided to capitalize on the port village of Dyrrhachium, directly across from their own port of Bari. Dyrrhachium became the starting point, as I said, of that famous Via Ignatia, and this infinitely helped people over the centuries from dealing with the equally, if not more so, treacherous terrain heading east toward Constantinople. From where Guiscard stood on the island of Corfu, he could in fact jump to the mainland, where Bohemond had already set up a beachhead, and then march his 1,000-strong force up over the numerous 6,000-foot-high peaks of the Caronian Mountains. These mountains of legend have been cited in works ranging from the Roman poet Ovid to Great Britain's Romance poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. He could certainly do that. But landscape challenges aside, was it worth it? He would spend a few days disembarking all of his ships, another couple of days loading up the horses with supplies and, creating the means to transport his already constructed siege engines across such terrain. I mean, it just didn't make any sense to do that. He had a whole naval fleet already loaded up. Why would he do that? However, I mentioned the Straits of Otranto could be a bit moody. And as you sail up the coastline toward Durazzo, you had to pass a certain promontory called the Acro-Caronian Point. As I mentioned, the Caronian Mountains were the stuff of ancient legend, and the Acro-Caronian Point was one reason why. Acro is a Greek root meaning high, while Koronos is Greek for thunderbolts. So the translation could be seen as a point from which thunderbolts were cast from on high. This would make sense, since there are maritime legends that abound from this area, attesting to it being a point upon which the land and the sea together made sailing a very, very difficult affair. It was said that Zeus himself would shoot thunderbolts at passing ships for sport, and when he missed, the waves would rise up from the impact. Ah, legends. There's no knowing if Guiscard was aware of the stories of the coastline's reputation. I think he was. But either way, I feel like Guiscard wouldn't have shied away from even Zeus's thunderbolts when given a chance. Guiscard ordered his fleet to sail north. Well, to be clear, only part of his fleet sailed north, and this is another important piece of clarification to make before we continue. Guiscard divided things up just a bit, like this. Obviously, the ships would sail north. He would accompany his ships, so he would lead the naval force, because it would be far more trouble than it was worth to try to drag each and every siege engine already, assembled across the mountainous terrain. But not all of his ships would be packed with men. The vast majority of his heavy cavalry, including supplies for their overland journey and their horses, would be unloaded on the mainland. This breakaway force would fare far better overland, so that's what they did. This contingent overland would be led by his son Bohemond. And it's worth mentioning that he had another smaller contingent of light infantry and supplies coming from Otranto, presumably led by his wife Siculgata. I say presumably because we know that she was intricately involved in this particular invasion and played a part in it later. You'll see that in a few episodes. But I haven't found anything to say specifically that Siculgata was with him during his capture of Corfu and his start up north. So we know that Siculgata would arrive at some point, and we know that another smaller fleet of, reinforcements and supplies were coming. So I am assuming, until I'm told otherwise, until I learn otherwise, I'm assuming that Siculgata would have led this little fleet over later. So, as I said, it's a presumption, but until I hear otherwise, I think it's a good one. So, in short, Guiscard led the fleet up the coast. Bohemond led the heavy cavalry through the mountains, and presumably Siculgata led the reinforcements from Otranto. All right. Anna Komnene, in her book, The Alexiad, gives us a tremendous account of what happens next. She writes that the Norman fleet was nearing Durazzo, quote, when it was suddenly struck by a tremendous storm There was a heavy fall of snow, and winds blowing furiously from the mountains lashed up the sea. There was a howling noise as the waves built up. Oars snapped off as the rowers plunged them into the water. The sails were torn to shreds by the blasts. Yardarms were crushed and fell on the decks. And now, ships were being swallowed up, crew and all. And yet it was the summer season. Everybody was confused and dismayed, not knowing what to do. Unable to resist such enemies, a terrible cry arose as they groaned and lamented, calling on God, imploring his aid, and praying that they might see the mainland. End quote. Gosh, I've said it before, but Anna is a great writer. Now, unfortunately for Guiscard, this was only the beginning. She continues, quote, "But the tempest did not die down, as if God was venting his wrath on Robert for the unyielding, presumptuous arrogance of the man, as if he were showing by a sign at the very outpost that the end would be disastrous." End quote. Listen, it's not much of a spoiler here because I think it's safe to say that we know a Norman never sat on the throne of Eastern Rome. History would have played out incalculably different. So I'll go ahead and say that Anna Komnene was writing this well after the death of her father, Alexios, and she had the benefit of hindsight. So placing a little divine judgment on Robert Guiscard was a pretty safe bet here. But she continued the narration in this way, quote, "Anyway, some of the ships sank and their crews drowned with them. Others were dashed against the headlands and broke up. The hides that covered the towers were slackened by the rain, so that the nails fell out and the wooden towers collapsed. They fell in ruins and sank the ships. Robert's own vessel, although half shattered, barely made its way to safety. And some transport ships also escaped unbelievably without losing their crews. Many corpses were thrown up by the waves, and not a few treasures and other objects brought by the sailors of Robert's fleet were strewn on the land. The survivors buried their dead with due ceremony. But because it was no easy matter to inter so many, they suffered horribly from the stench. They would soon have perished with hunger too, for all of their supplies had been lost, if all the crops had not been ripe, and the fields and gardens bursting with fruit." End quote. Anna paints an incredibly grim picture of what Robert Guiscard's fleet was up against as they moved northward toward Durazzo. And I've yet to find a single historian to find it all hard to believe. By all accounts, it seems Guiscard's fleet was really devastated by some freak summer storm as they passed the fabled Acrocuronian Point, leading some to a second and even third look at the myths as validating the ancients' experiences. But even this, the work of freak weather shifts or the work of Zeus himself, even this did not deter Guiscard from his mission. Anna writes, quote, "What had happened was significant to all men of sound judgment, but not to Robert. None of it frightened him or affected his iron nerve. If he did pray that his life might be spared, it was only, I suppose, for as long as he could wage war on his chosen enemies." End quote. Now, after the storm, we learn that Guiscard needed to stop and catch his breath, to, reorient himself and to take stock in what was left. He took the better part of a week to reorganize his men, his supplies, his ships, and his siege engines, not to mention letting his men rest and regroup themselves, which he knew was important given the ordeal they'd just survived. He did this, Anna says, at a place called Glabanica, before moving northward. She qualifies her work at this point by saying that she was given all of her information of this event and subsequent events, both what we've heard already and what is about to happen, from a, quote, Latin who was with Guiscard, an envoy, so he told me, from the Bishop of Bari, end quote. Assuming Anna Komnene can be believed, this is as good as a first-hand account, in my estimation. By June 17th, 1081, Robert Guiscard had encamped himself just south of Durazzo. Guiscard met his son Bohemond within a couple days of making it to shore after the storm. I can't imagine the shock Bohemond must have had when he rode up to the decimated forces led by his father. He was supposed to have had the hardest journey, not his father. Bohemond's men fell in with the battered and exhausted men who came from the ships, and the army began to quickly regroup itself, to coalesce. Rest, food and water, reorganization of ranks and supplies and weaponry, and an immediate rebuilding process to fix all those surviving siege towers. Eventually, after just a few days, things began to gain a sense of organization and confidence once again. A confidence that only the Normans seemed to be able to ensure after such a tragedy. During this time, Sikelgaita, again my own assumption that she was leading this, Sikelgaita arrived with the small force from Otranto to help bolster the effort and morale. Within a week, Guiscard and his army had also worked their way to the walls of Durazzo. Now, remember, Durazzo was a port city, so all of it was within sight of the Adriatic Sea to the west. As the siege towers were pulled into place and the armies formed up their ranks, Guiscard began preparing for his onslaught. There was no time for a prolonged siege. He heard of this Alexios Komnenos, and he knew that he was a formidable foe. Guiscard couldn't imagine a military mind like Alexios Komnenos not having already started his way westward across the Balkans to Durazzo. And even if Alexios wasn't, acting as if it were true would instill the urgency of the situation and up the ferocity with which his men would fight. Guiscard assumed incorrectly Alexios was not yet on his way. And it seems that while Guiscard's navy was battered and Bohemon's forces were helping to fix the situation and the reserve forces arrived, Emperor Alexios I had decided that the east was secure for now, and it was time to deal with the Norman menace to his west. So the preparations were, coming together to move west, but by June they hadn't yet. He had already begun gathering his army back in Constantinople. So it's coming, but not quite yet. But Alexios knew that Georgios Palaiologos, his man, would hold down Durazzo. He had full confidence in Palaiologos. But Guiscard had not predicted one thing that would prove quite consequential. Alexios I was a master deal maker, and he'd already sent letters to the Venetians as well as the German crown. Yeah, the German crown. We know already the deal he offered King Henry IV of Germany, including a betrothal. But to the Venetians, he offered something that would have irrevocable influence on the future of that city-state, and really the future of European history. Alexios I offered the Venetians unprecedented access and control over trade throughout the Adriatic Sea, the Ionian Sea, and the Aegean Sea. Venice had the doors thrown wide open to what would become their claim to fame. And it was then, in June of 1081, when the Venetian Empire would see its first actual heartbeats of life. Now, I'm not saying Venice is an empire yet, but this is where they get their first heartbeats of life. It was an offer the Venetians would simply be fools to pass up. And Venetians were anything but foolish. They were very, very smart business people. As Guiscard readied his men for the assaults on Durazzo, dark lines emerged on the northwestern horizon. Within hours, the Normans made these dark lines on the waves out to be gigantic masts. As John Julius Norwich writes in his book, The Other Conquest, quote, "By their curious rig, halfway between the Greek and the Italian, they were all too easily identifiable as Venetians," end quote. In Norwich's words, these self-proclaimed, quote-unquote, keepers of the peace throughout the Adriatic had a vested interest in keeping the Adriatic free from being controlled by just one power. Venice was 100% invested in the sea. They had land-based trade, but they were all in on trade with faraway places, and being that entity that provided such trade to those places inland, such as Germany and other Central and Northern European markets, Venice wanted to be that main port. But the Venetian ships merely sat on the horizon at this point, stretching from one end to the other in a seemingly infinite naval force. Their presence was enough to stave off the Norman leadership from unleashing hell upon the walls of Durazzo. However, as mighty as the Venetians could be on the waves, the Normans were confident in their recent naval successes, namely the one conducted by Great Count Roger of Sicily in Guiscard's conquest of Bari, which, as we know, irrevocably kicked the Byzantines out of Italy forever. Match that with the various small skirmishes on the high seas around Sicily and outside of Amalfi and Salerno, and you have reason to be confident if you are a Norman. But that's not all. Guiscard knew that any fleet sent by Emperor Alexios would pale in comparison to the once mighty Byzantine navies of the past. One could almost at this point ask, what Byzantine navy? Like, which one? I don't see a Byzantine navy at this time, which is precisely why Alexios reached out to the Venetians. Guiscard chose to man his ships with the express purpose of keeping the Venetian soldiers from establishing a beachhead. However, Norwich writes, quote, "Under the cover of darkness, the Venetians bore down upon the Apulian fleet," end quote. And this is where the details of the battle come to life. So, you know that I, for my own benefit as well as, I hope, yours, like to always be comparing and contrasting different moments in history in the hopes of finding, continuity in our human story, some connections. After a little extra research, I'd like to start this next part, roughly 530 years before Guiscard's naval battle outside of Durazzo. The year was 555 AD. And the Eastern Roman Empire was in the midst of the monumentally consequential reign of Emperor Justinian the Great. Justinian had a legendary general of his own, who was named Belisarius. Belisarius was ordered to head to Sicily and take the island in the name of Eastern Rome. For context, Western Rome had already fallen. The various Gothic tribes had spread out across Central Europe, the Italian peninsula, across Iberia, and even into North Africa. This was, to be sure, before Islam was even founded. All of that talk on this podcast about how Greek Sicily and southern Italy actually was in the 11th century, well, that all started with Justinian and his general, Belisarius. So, Belisarius was a great general for many reasons, but for our purposes, let's focus on this one reason. He was able to make gold out of lead. That is, much like Alexios Komnenos, Belisarius had very, very little to work with, and he took down empires, namely the mighty transcontinental kingdom of the Vandals. During his siege of Palermo in 555, Belisarius was hurting. Lack of everything forced him to get creative. He ordered the various smaller boats used to row ashore to be hoisted up to the mastheads, as high as they can go. To use Norwich's words, that is. They parked those boats as close as possible to the walls and had archers fire volleys of arrows from the elevated positions. Rule number one in warfare, whether offense or defense, is to secure the high ground. Heck, even Obi-Wan Kenobi knew that much. From this vantage point, crucial intel could be spied and communicated to the officers below, while those arrows found many more marks than if they were simply volleyed over from the lower on the ship deck. Belisarius took Palermo in that way, kicking off Greek revivals across the island of Sicily. It's easy to think that people lived day to day, generation to generation, with very little knowledge of the past, but I urge you against such thinking. They certainly didn't have the internet like we have today, but these people were serious students of history. And people talk, right? People talk. This is how we find the Venetians as they settled up against Guiscard's Norman fleet, taking a page out of Belisarius's playbook from over 5 centuries before this. This was less that the stories of Belisarius's greatness were renowned far and wide. Rather, everyone within the Byzantine fold were students of Roman history, just as the Franks were students of Charlemagne, and the Spanish would someday become students of El Cid, and everyone would become students of Napoleon or Robert E. Lee or Eisenhower, on and on. But these were Venetians. Why would the Venetians have such knowledge of Belisarius, a great Byzantine leader? It's merely a sign of the close connections the two states had been cultivating for decades. In the West, at least, Eastern Rome had come to consider Venice as the de facto imperial navy, as long as they continued to court the Venetians appropriately. Remember, Venice went Catholic. They were not Orthodox, so they had to be very careful when they're courting these Venetians, especially after 1054, I should say. But by 1081, Alexios Komnenos was well aware of the exceptional capabilities of Venetian naval warfare. William of Apulia would describe Venice like this, quote, "These people were brave and well-versed in naval warfare, for the imperial request was sent to Venice, a coastal city both rich and populous, which is washed by the last northern waves of the Adriatic. These people's walls are entirely surrounded by sea. They cannot move from one house to another without going by boat. They live always on the water, and no person surpasses them in naval battles and in navigation at sea." End quote. Emperor Alexius sought to exploit it as much as he could while Guiscard was on the coast. See, this close bond between Constantinople and Venice afforded Venice the knowledge of hoisting their own small boats to the top of the masts and filling them with archers. But it was all about surprise. So let's reconnect our story. As the Venetian fleet approached, Guiscard ordered his men to the ships. Durazzo would still be there after they dealt with these merchants. By the time both fleets neared one another, the sun was low, but the initial skirmishes allowed each other to test the other's defenses. But see, that's what the Venetians wanted the Normans to think. They knew an hour or so would be as much fighting as would happen, and much of that could be sailing around and only engaging a little bit. The Normans felt they had them on the ropes by the time fighting stopped altogether, each fleet sailing a healthy distance from one another, and the sky darkened. A temporary peace was agreed between leaders, and arrangements were made for Guiscard to send a contingent of Norman officers to the Venetians to secure an official surrender from them the next morning. According to Malaterra, that night the Normans were feeling pretty good. They'd bested the mighty Venetian fleet, and they were hours away from an official surrender. The Normans went back into harbor near Durazzo, a harbor that was vital for the Greeks to hold, by the way, and they spent the night preparing to shift their gaze back to Durazzo. Throughout the night, the Venetians were doing everything but preparing to surrender and sail back home. Having learned the lessons of Byzantine naval history, they hoisted those small boats up to the top of their masts, way up high, filled them with men, with javelins and rocks and arrows, and they waited for sunrise. Now, at sunrise, a small flotilla of Normans, led by Bohemond, sailed out of the harbor to present the terms of surrender. What they saw was a Venetian fleet in full battle formation, all with small boats hanging precariously high and manned with men. The ships themselves all tied together in a makeshift harbor of their own. Bohemond and his men beheld what had to be one of the most impressive sights of the Middle Ages. Nervously, he approached the ships. The men high in the dinghies, tied to the mastheads, began raining insults down on the Normans. Anna Komnene tells us something I found rather humorous. She writes, quote, "They made fun of his beard," end quote. Yeah, the Venetians made fun of Bohemond's beard, much like the French taunted King Arthur in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. She continues, quote, "Unable to bear the insult, Bohemond led the attack on them in person, making for the biggest ships. Others followed him. The battle was fiercely contested. However, when Bohemond was fighting with even greater ferocity, they hurled down one of these great blocks of wood which I mentioned from aloft and holed the ship on which he happened to be. The water was sucking the Franks down, and as they were in danger of being engulfed, some jumped overboard but found themselves in exactly the same trouble and were drowned. Others went on fighting the Venetians and were killed. Bohemond himself, with his own life at stake, leapt into another of his ships, and took refuge there." End quote. Guiscard immediately raised the sails and pushed his entire fleet in full force out of the harbor to meet the Venetians, but he stayed on shore, not wanting to jeopardize his position on land outside of Durazzo. With the harbor empty, the Venetians pushed straight through the oncoming Norman ships, not stopping to engage at all, and they pushed nearly every ship into the safety of Durazzo's harbor. And as the Norman fleet turned around and raced them back toward the harbor that they'd just lost, the Venetians who had the edge on them turned on them. The Normans knew they couldn't break through to the harbor, so they angled themselves toward the shores where Guiscard's land forces were. But the Venetians weren't finished. They had a message to send these Frank menaces. Anna writes, quote, "Reaching dry land, they," that is the Venetians, "jumped overboard and started another battle with them," that is the Normans. End quote. At this point, Georgios Palaiologos led a sortie of his own to distract and spread chaos into the entire situation, and it was more successful than he probably intended. He almost made it to Guiscard's own position, according to Anna. He quickly pulled back as the Venetians retreated back to their ships and headed for the harbor that was now theirs, leaving the Normans confused and disoriented, many dead. Remember, the sun by this point had just risen above the horizon. What a hectic morning. These Venetians didn't just bring naval supremacy, they brought food and supplies too. Palaiologos must have been beside himself with relief, especially since word came that Alexios Komnenos himself was mustering that force to come westward. It was a masterstroke by the Venetians. Guiscard had not only lost his position in the harbor, but he had been humiliated and he had been tricked. We can only imagine how he took this, watching the Venetians sailing unopposed into a harbor which he had just held. The Normans were right back to where they started, only morale took a hit, which is never good in war. That night, though, Malaterra tells us that the Venetians weren't finished. He writes, quote, "They donned their arms by moonlight," end quote. And just before the sun rose, they engaged Guiscard and his fleet outside of the harbor. But the Venetians had one more trick up their sleeves, and yet another sign of the close bond Venice had with Constantinople, not to mention the de facto naval status it held for the empire. And this story begins roughly 400 years before the Venetians and the Normans battled outside Durazzo. This story begins with a Syrian Jew in the year 672, fleeing the newest desert cult currently sweeping across the Middle East. This man's name was Kallinikos, and he fled to Constantinople with a secret. See, Kallinikos was an architect with intimate knowledge of chemistry, and he had a new invention to sell to the highest bidder, though he was hoping the highest bidder would be some Romans who had kicked these new Muslims out of his home country. See, the beginnings of this invention is as much of a mystery as what the invention actually was. Even to us today, it's still quite the mystery. Building upon knowledge going back centuries, Kallinikos created a mixture using what experts today even struggle with. Any combination of the following ingredients are thought to have been used: crude oil, calcium oxide, calcium phosphate, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and even pine resin. Crude oil was crude oil, but you can find calcium oxide in quicklime. Calcium phosphates were found in organic materials like bones. Potassium nitrates can be harvested from processing things like guano. And sulfur can be found in a myriad of rocks, most notably around volcanoes, hot springs, and in deserts. These ingredients weren't unknown and not exactly uncommon a couple thousand years ago. And this Kallinikos got his hands on some, and he made a mixture that would change the way naval warfare would be waged until the advent of gunpowder. The Eastern Roman Empire would keep this mixture one of its highest state secrets for the duration of the empire and beyond. At first, it was known as sea fire, then liquid fire, or even sticky fire. But after the First Crusades, when the Holy Land was inundated with untold numbers of Europeans who brought back stories of the Middle East and its inhabitants, this sticky fire came to be called what we know it by today, Greek fire. The Venetians, somehow, though assuredly through their close connections with Constantinople, came to be in possession of this mysterious sludge that could be set on fire. And it could be set on fire even underwater. That's right. Greek fire was a substance that could catch things on fire under the surface of the water. That is precisely how it changed naval warfare games. Had Greek fire been given to the likes of Vikings, or the Muslims, or the Pisans, or the Genoese, history could be very different, though, to be fair, there are records indicating Muslim forces tinkered around with that recipe in the 8th and 9th centuries. But it must not have been right because it was abandoned before the 10th century. As a humiliated and livid Guiscard rushed full steam ahead toward the Venetian fleet in the earliest hours of the pre-dawn morning the next day, he had no idea what he was about to witness. Initially, the Venetians utilized their high ground with the boats at the top of the masts, allowing clouds of arrows and rocks and javelins to rain down upon the Normans. But like any boxer knows, you have to get in close to minimize the damage that you take.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
The Normans pulled in close and began boarding the many Venetian ships, creating islands of melees. Venetian sailor versus Norman knight. Malaterra tells us that both sides were fierce and fought very bravely, but, he says, quote, the Venetians, using hidden pipes, spread artificial fire, the sort called Greek fire, which water cannot extinguish, onto the sea, and they treacherously set fire to one of our ships, of the type called a cat, as it floated on the waves. End quote. This shifted the battlefield as the sinking ship caught everyone's attention. I imagine it as a scene stopper, the proverbial record being slurred to a stop, the onlookers stopping their fighting to watch in horror at what seemed to them like magic. Fire that stayed lit on top of water, under the surface of the waves. The Normans shook themselves loose of the horrific scene unfolding before them, and without details we learned they returned the favor and sunk a rather large and expensive Venetian ship. Malaterra breaks it down like this, quote, both sought to break off the battle, for our men were scared of their stratagems, and theirs were afraid of our valor. End quote. At that point, both boxers retreated to their individual corners, Venetians to their harbor in Durazzo, and the Normans to the shore outside of the walls. So after all of this, the launching of a naval fleet, thus leaving the defense of the city up to chance, the correspondence decked out in promises both ways between Venice and Constantinople, and the blood and coins spent. After all of this, why did Venice join in the first place? This was a battle between the Eastern Romans and the Southern Normans. Venice was a maritime power of trade, not necessarily military. In fact, one could say that in terms of military power on the high seas, Pisa might have had more of a claim as the Mediterranean powerhouse than did Venice in the 1080s. Georgios Theotokos, in his book Bohemond of Taranto, stated, quote, trade was the most significant factor that brought these two parties together, and for a good reason. Constantinople and the Byzantine ports of the eastern Mediterranean were the treasure houses of Venetian trade, and the Venetians quickly adapted to the larger roles of middlemen between East and West. End quote. He goes on to mention that a substantial portion of the residents of Durazzo were actually transplants over the previous decades, transplants from both Amalfi and Venice. So there were connections with Durazzo's people as well. What's more is that what Theotokos called, quote-unquote, the lifeline of Venice's trade was the eastern coastline of the Adriatic. It seemed the vast majority of Venice's trade followed the route up and down the eastern Adriatic, as it was the friendliest seas than those controlled by the Normans in Apulia. Venice needed, as almost a prerequisite and a requirement for their continued growth and wealth and influence, they needed those eastern Adriatic routes clear of the Norman. These routes included smaller ports up and down Dalmatia and the eastern Balkans, but they most certainly included Durazzo and Corfu. By the time the Venetians arrived to protect these sea lanes, Corfu had already fallen. The Normans were quick, and they were deadly. Venice simply couldn't afford to sit this one out. And so they came. And in July of 1081, with Durazzo under increasing pressure from Guiscard's fierce siege, they delivered a setback. A pretty big one, actually. See, if allowed, this siege should have been a two-pronged siege, one from the land and one from the harbor, much like they did at Amalfi and Salerno. But with Venice present, this would be a challenge. However, with the Venetians stepping up bravely to the feared Normans, and then deploying their secret weapon, well, a sea-based siege was just not in the question. Venice was vital to Durazzo's safety. What's more is that it pushed Alexios Komnenos to put a little hitch in his giddy-up and get out there sooner. Guiscard was beaten temporarily. The sooner he could capitalize on that, the better. And one more minor but still significant twist was that when word spread about the Venetian supremacy over the Normans, behind Guiscard, the towns and villages and ports pockmarking the route he had sailed and his son Bohemond had marched all threw off their forced allegiances and tributes to the Norman invaders. They all announced their loyalty back to the empire. Those who rose in revolt at Guiscard's back included the entire island of Corfu. By August of 1081, Robert Guiscard was encamped outside Durazzo, his siege engines doing their best against the city's walls. He was forced to wake up every morning with the Venetian fleet outside in the distance, looming in the harbor like sentinels. In addition to the Venetians, Byzantine ships were trickling in from all corners to bolster the Venetian navy. Word came that the emperor was inching ever closer. Georgios Palaiologos continued to order random, surprise sorties at all hours of day and night to keep the Normans' nerves frayed. And with the loss of Corfu, crossing the Strait of Otranto became more treacherous, and Norman resources and provisions began to slowly dwindle. And in all of that, disease took a firm grip on the Norman camps, and there is no greater enemy to humans anywhere at any time in history than disease. What started out so promising in June began spiraling downward by August. If Robert Guiscard was going to take the crown of Eastern Rome, he was going to have to start praying for miracles. Now, on the next episode, we're actually going to take a look back. There's a lot going on between Rome and Germany. Don't forget, Tuscany is right between those two, sandwiched right in the middle. We're going to go back and take a look at what's going on there. Not because I want to break away from this narrative, but because what happens there will directly affect the way Guiscard goes forward with his invasion. So we need to take a look at what's happening between Gregory VII, Matilda of Tuscany, and King Henry IV of Germany. So let's take a look at that on the next episode, and I promise you, the following episode, we will return to what's happening with Guiscard over in Durazzo. And I can't wait to tell you about it.